On July 2, 1973, Frank Matthews, the most powerful independent black drug trafficker in America, a man who controlled heroin and cocaine distribution networks across 21 states, who'd amassed a fortune estimated at $20 or $50 million, who law enforcement considered more dangerous and more sophisticated than most Italian mob families, walked into his Brooklyn safe house, removed approximately $20 million in cash from a hidden vault, placed the money in several leather bags, picked up his girlfriend, Cheryl Denise Brown, drove to the airport, and disappeared completely. Matthews has never been found. No confirmed sightings, no arrests, no body, no evidence of what happened after he boarded a flight on July 2nd, 1973. For 50 years, Matthews has remained one of law enforcement's most frustrating, unsolved mysteries, a major criminal who simply vanished with one of the largest amounts of cash ever stolen, leaving behind properties, businesses, criminal operations, and associates, who never saw or heard from him again. But what law enforcement never understood, what they couldn't understand because they didn't know the relationship between Frank Matthews and Bumpy Johnson, was why Matthews disappeared when he did, at the height of his power, when he seemed unstoppable. What they didn't know was that Matthews was following advice given to him 8 years earlier by Bumpy Johnson, advice that Matthews remembered and acted upon at exactly the moment when acting upon it saved his life and his freedom. The advice was simple, delivered during a conversation in 1965 when Matthews was still rising through criminal ranks, and Johnson was near the end of his legendary career. Everything has a beginning and an end. The art isn't in beginning. Anyone can start something. The art is in knowing when to end and having the discipline to actually end it when that moment comes. I never learned that art. But you're smarter than I was. You can learn it if you're paying. Attention. Matthews paid attention, and 8 years later, in July 1973, he demonstrated that he'd learned the art that Bumpy Johnson never mastered, the art of knowing when to walk away and actually walking away before it was too late. Frank Matthews was 26 years old in 1965, working as a mid-level heroin dealer in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. He was smart, ambitious, disciplined, the kind of young criminal who studied operations carefully, who understood that success required strategy and intelligence rather than just violence and intimidation. But he was also relatively unknown outside Brooklyn, still building his reputation, still learning how criminal enterprises operated at higher levels. Bumpy Johnson was 60 years old in 1965, recently returned from serving 10 years at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, rebuilding his control over Harlem's criminal operations after a decade away. Johnson was a legend in black criminal circles, someone who'd survived gang wars in the 1930s, who'd maintained independence from Italian mob families through intelligence and strategic thinking, who'd earned respect from the most powerful white criminals in America through demonstrated capability. Their first meeting happened through mutual connections. Theodore Green, the attorney who worked with both Italian mob families and black operators, arranged an introduction because Matthews had asked to meet Johnson, wanted advice from someone who'd succeeded at the highest levels of criminal operations for decades. The meeting took place at Small's Paradise on 7th Avenue in Harlem on a Tuesday evening in March 1965. Johnson arrived alone, walking with a cane. He'd had health problems since his release from Alcatraz, but still carrying himself with the dignity and presence that had made him legendary. Matthews arrived nervous but respectful, understanding he was meeting someone whose reputation transcended criminal circles and had become part of Harlem's cultural history. "Mr. Johnson," Matthews said as they sat down in a private booth, "thank you for meeting with me. I know your time is valuable." Johnson studied Matthews for a moment. evaluating, assessing, determining whether this young dealer was worth his attention. Theodore tells me you're smart, that you think strategically, that you want to build something bigger than just street-level dealing. Is that accurate? Yes, sir, Matthews said. I want to build distribution networks that cover multiple cities, that handle volume the Italian families handle, that operate professionally rather than through constant violence. But I don't know how to get from where I am to where I want to be. That's why I asked to meet you. I need to learn from someone who built what I'm trying to build. Johnson smiled slightly. Most young dealers I meet want to learn tactics, how to avoid law enforcement, how to handle competition, how to collect debts. You're asking about strategy, how to build something sustainable. That's smarter. What specifically do you want to know? Matthews had prepared for this conversation carefully. I want to know how you maintained independence from Italian families. Everyone says you ran Harlem for decades without surrendering to mob control, that you earned their respect rather than their domination. How did you do that? Johnson leaned back, considering how to answer. I did it through demonstrated intelligence. I played chess with Lucky Luciano in 1935 and beat him in 6 minutes. That game earned me respect because it proved I thought strategically, that I could compete intellectually with the most powerful white criminals in America. After that game, Luciano gave Harlem operational autonomy because he understood that trying to control intelligent operators by force was more expensive than cooperating with them as equals. That's the lesson. Prove you're too intelligent to be treated as subordinate, and more powerful organizations will. Respect your independence rather than fighting to dominate you. Matthews absorbed this carefully. So intelligence earns respect that violence can't earn. Intelligence earns sustainable respect, Johnson corrected. Violence earns temporary fear. Fear fades when someone more violent appears. But respect for intelligence lasts because intelligent operators create value, solve problems, operate professionally in ways that benefit everyone, including their nominal competitors. That's what you need to focus on, being so intelligent, so strategic, so professional in your operations that more powerful organizations see you as someone worth cooperating with rather than someone who needs to be eliminated or dominated. They talked for 3 hours that first evening, Johnson sharing lessons learned from 40 years of criminal operations, Matthews asking thoughtful questions that revealed he was indeed smarter than most young dealers Johnson encountered. From that first meeting in March 1965 until Johnson's death in July 1968, Frank Matthews and Bumpy Johnson maintained a professional relationship that benefited Matthews enormously. They met approximately once every 2 or 3 months, sometimes at Small's Paradise in Harlem, sometimes at restaurants in Brooklyn, occasionally at Johnson's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. During these meetings, Johnson essentially mentored Matthews on how to build and operate large-scale criminal enterprises. The advice covered everything: distribution networks, how to establish reliable supply chains across multiple cities without creating vulnerabilities that law enforcement or competitors could exploit. Personnel management, how to hire and manage people who were competent without being so ambitious that they'd eventually challenge your authority. Law enforcement relations, how to operate in ways that minimized law enforcement attention while understanding that some attention was inevitable and needed to be managed rather than avoided completely. Competition management, how to handle competitors through strategic cooperation rather than through constant violence that attracted attention and depleted resources. Money management, how to move and hide large amounts of cash, how to invest criminal proceeds into legitimate businesses, how to build wealth that could survive criminal convictions or organization collapse. Matthews absorbed everything Johnson taught him, implementing strategies that allowed him to expand rapidly from mid-level Brooklyn dealer to major regional distributor to national operator controlling networks across the East Coast and beyond. By 1967, Matthews was already becoming wealthy and powerful, not yet at the level he'd reach in the early 1970s, but clearly rising fast, clearly building something significant. Johnson watched this rise with satisfaction, seeing that Matthews had learned lessons well, was applying strategic thinking effectively, was becoming the kind of sophisticated criminal operator that Johnson had always valued. During a meeting in October 1967, Johnson said something that revealed both pride and concern. "Frank, you're building something impressive. You're smarter and more disciplined than most people I've met in this business. But remember, the higher you climb, the harder you'll eventually fall. Everyone falls eventually. The question isn't whether you'll fall, it's whether you'll see the fall coming in time to do something about it." Matthews asked, "What do you mean? If I'm smart and careful, why do I have to fall?" Johnson sighed, "Because law enforcement never stops, because competitors never stop, because the business itself creates pressures that eventually overwhelm even the smartest operators. I've survived longer than most people in this business, but even I've spent years in prison. Even I've had close calls that could have ended everything. The business is designed to destroy you eventually, through arrest, through violence, through betrayal, through something you can't predict or control. That's just reality." On May 15, 1968, less than 2 months before Bumpy Johnson's death, Matthews and Johnson had what would be their final lengthy conversation. They met at Johnson's apartment in Harlem, which Johnson rarely left anymore due to declining health. Johnson was 63 years old, suffering from heart problems that would kill him 7 weeks later, knowing his time was limited. Matthews arrived bringing food from a restaurant Johnson liked, and they ate together while discussing Matthews' operations, which by mid-1968 had expanded significantly. Matthews was now handling major heroin shipments, working with suppliers in multiple countries, distributing across a dozen states, generating revenue that put him among the wealthiest black criminals in America. After dinner, they sat in Johnson's living room, and Johnson said something that Matthews would remember for the rest of his life. "Frank, I'm dying. My doctor says my heart is failing, says I might have months or might have weeks, but definitely don't have years. So I want to tell you something important while I still can, something I've learned but never successfully applied to my own life." Matthews leaned forward, listening carefully, understanding that Johnson was sharing wisdom that came from recognizing his own mortality. "Everything has a beginning and an end," Johnson said slowly, his voice weakened by illness, but his mind still sharp. "The art isn't in beginning. Anyone can start something. Young dealers start operations every day. The art is in knowing when to end and having the discipline to actually end it when that moment comes. That's the art I never learned, Frank. I never learned when to walk away. I kept operating, kept building, kept competing, even when I should have stopped. I went to Alcatraz in 1953 because I didn't know when to end my criminal operations, didn't have discipline to walk away from something I'd built. I came back in 1963 and rebuilt again, and now I'm dying at 63 instead of living to be 80 because I never learned when enough was enough." Johnson paused, looking directly at Matthews with intensity that made clear this wasn't casual conversation. This was a dying man trying to pass crucial wisdom to someone who still had time to benefit from it. "You're smarter than I was, Frank. You're more disciplined, more strategic. You can learn the art I never learned. You can recognize when you've made enough money, when you've built enough success, when continuing becomes more dangerous than stopping. And when you recognize that moment, and you will recognize it if you're paying attention, you need to have the discipline to actually end it, to walk away, to disappear with your money and your freedom before law enforcement destroys you, or competitors kill you, or something else takes everything you've built. Matthews asked, "How will I know when that moment comes?" Johnson smiled slightly. "You'll know. You'll feel it. There'll be a moment when law enforcement pressure increases beyond normal levels, when too many people know too much about your operations, when you realize that continuing is no longer building wealth. It's just risking everything you've already built. That moment will come, probably within the next 5 to 10 years, based on how fast you're growing. And when it comes, remember what I'm telling you now, knowing when to end is an art. I never mastered that art, but you can. You're young enough, smart enough, disciplined enough. Don't make my mistake of staying too long. Know when to end, and actually end it when that time comes." They talked for another hour, Johnson sharing more specific advice about how to prepare for an eventual exit, how to hide money that couldn't be traced, how to create new identities, how to disappear in ways that law enforcement couldn't track. Johnson had never done these things himself, but he'd thought about them extensively during his decade at Alcatraz, had developed theoretical frameworks for how someone smarter and more disciplined than him could actually achieve what he'd never achieved: a successful exit from criminal life. Before that, life destroyed him. When Matthews left that evening, Johnson said one final thing. "Remember, Frank, the art is knowing when to end. I couldn't master that art, but you can. Don't let this business take everything from you the way it took everything from me. Be smarter than I was. End it while you're ahead." 7 weeks later, on July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack at age 63. Matthews attended the funeral, standing among hundreds of Harlem residents who'd come to mourn a legend. And as Matthews watched Johnson's casket being carried out of the church, he thought about Johnson's words, "Everything has a beginning and an end. The art is knowing when to end." In the 5 years following Bumpy Johnson's death, Frank Matthews became the most powerful independent black drug trafficker in American history. He built distribution networks that spanned 21 states, established direct relationships with suppliers in South America and Asia that eliminated Italian mob middlemen, moved product in volume that rivaled major mob families, and amassed wealth estimated at $50 million. Matthews was sophisticated in ways that most drug dealers weren't. He kept detailed financial records using coded systems that law enforcement couldn't decipher. He invested criminal proceeds in legitimate businesses, including a bar, a restaurant, real estate holdings. He maintained relationships with Italian mob families based on mutual respect rather than subordination, remembering Bumpy Johnson's lesson that intelligence earned sustainable respect. He also avoided many mistakes that destroyed other drug dealers. He didn't use drugs himself, maintaining the discipline and clear thinking that success required. He limited violence to situations where violence was absolutely necessary, understanding that excessive violence attracted law enforcement attention. He paid associates well enough that loyalty was economically rational, reducing the risk of betrayal. By 1972, Matthews controlled what law enforcement called the largest heroin distribution network operated by black criminals in American history. He was wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined when he met Bumpy Johnson in 1965. He owned properties in multiple states, had offshore accounts in several countries, lived in luxury that rivaled legitimate millionaires. But Matthews also noticed something that Bumpy Johnson had predicted. The higher he climbed, the more dangerous his position became. Law enforcement attention was intensifying. The DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, newly created in 1973, was targeting major traffickers with unprecedented resources. Italian mob families were becoming concerned about Matthews' independence and were making subtle suggestions that he should work under their control rather than as an independent operator. Most concerning, too many people knew too much about Matthews' operations. As his networks expanded, he'd necessarily involved more people in his distribution chain, each of whom represented a potential vulnerability through arrest or betrayal. The organization that had made him wealthy was also creating the conditions that would eventually destroy him if he stayed too long. In January 1973, law enforcement pressure on Frank Matthews' organization increased dramatically. The DEA, in its first year of existence, had identified Matthews as a priority target and was devoting significant resources to building a case against him. Informants were being developed. Surveillance was intensifying. Arrests of lower-level associates were designed to create pressure that would eventually reach Matthews himself. In February 1973, Matthews was indicted on federal drug trafficking charges in Brooklyn. He posted a $5 million bail, the largest bail ever set at that time, and remained free while preparing for trial. But Matthews understood what the indictment meant. Law enforcement had decided to destroy him, and they had enough evidence and enough resources to do it. The trial would probably result in conviction. The conviction would result in decades in federal prison. His wealth, his freedom, his life as he knew it, all of it would end. In March 1973, Matthews began quietly preparing for the possibility that he might need to disappear. He moved money from various accounts into cash that couldn't be traced. He consolidated resources that were scattered across multiple properties in multiple states into a few locations where they could be accessed quickly if necessary. He discussed with his girlfriend, Cheryl Denise Brown, the possibility that they might need to leave their lives behind completely and start over somewhere else under new identities. In April 1973, 2 of Matthews' associates were arrested and began cooperating with law enforcement, providing information about Matthews' operations in exchange for reduced sentences. Matthews learned about this cooperation through contacts he maintained with corrupt law enforcement officials who provided advance warning about investigations. By May 1973, Matthews understood that his time was running out. The DEA was closing in. Associates were betraying him. The trial was scheduled for later in 1973, and the evidence law enforcement had gathered would almost certainly result in conviction. If he stayed, he would lose everything: his freedom, his wealth, his life. And that's when Matthews remembered Bumpy Johnson's words from May 1968. There'll be a moment when you realize that continuing is no longer building wealth. It's just risking everything you've already built. That moment will come, and when it comes, remember, knowing when to end is an art. The moment had come. Matthews recognized it clearly. He was no longer building wealth or power. He was just fighting to avoid losing everything to law enforcement. Continuing meant going to trial, likely being convicted, spending decades in prison, losing all the money he'd accumulated. The smart move, the move that required the discipline Bumpy Johnson had talked about, was to end it now, while he still could. Throughout June 1973, Frank Matthews planned his disappearance with the same careful, strategic thinking that had made him successful in criminal operations. He understood that disappearing successfully required more than just leaving. It required preparation, resources, discipline, and timing. He moved more cash into physical currency that he could carry. He established offshore accounts under false names where he could access money after disappearing. He created multiple false identities with supporting documentation, birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses that would allow him and Cheryl to live under new names indefinitely. He also began withdrawing emotionally from his criminal operations, delegating more decisions to lieutenants, creating distance that would make his eventual disappearance less disruptive to the organization he was leaving behind. Matthews wasn't sentimental about this. He understood that the organization would probably collapse after he disappeared, that associates would be arrested or would scatter, that everything he'd built would essentially end when he ended his participation. But he also understood that preserving his own freedom was more important than preserving an organization that was already doomed by law enforcement attention. On June 25, 1973, Matthews had a long conversation with Cheryl about the plan. He explained that they would probably need to disappear within the next few weeks, that they'd be leaving everything behind, properties, businesses, friends, family, their entire lives, and starting over somewhere else under new identities, with no possibility of ever returning. Cheryl asked the obvious question, "Are you sure this is necessary? Maybe you can beat the charges at trial. Maybe you can negotiate with prosecutors. Maybe there's a way to stay and fight rather than running." Matthews responded with words that echoed Bumpy Johnson's philosophy. "I learned something from a man who was smarter than almost anyone I've met in this business. He told me that everything has a beginning and an end, and that the art is knowing when to end. This is the moment to end. I can feel it. If we stay, I go to prison and lose everything. If we leave now, we keep our freedom and enough money to live well for the rest of our lives. That's an easy choice when you think about it strategically rather than emotionally." Cheryl agreed. She trusted Matthews' strategic thinking, understood that he'd been right about almost everything throughout their relationship, and recognized that fighting law enforcement when law enforcement had overwhelming resources and evidence was a fight they couldn't win. On Monday, July the 2nd, 1973, Frank Matthews executed the plan he'd been preparing for months. He woke early, spent the morning finalizing last-minute arrangements, and then drove to his safe house in Brooklyn, where he kept his primary cash reserves. The safe house contained a hidden vault built into a basement wall, concealed behind false panels that law enforcement would have needed significant time and equipment to discover. Inside that vault was approximately $20 million in cash, a combination of hundreds, 50s, and 20s stored in vacuum-sealed packages to minimize volume and prevent deterioration. Matthews removed all the cash from the vault, placing it in several large leather bags that he could carry. $20 million in mixed denominations weighs approximately 400 pounds, too much for one person to carry easily, but manageable with multiple trips to a vehicle parked near the safe house entrance. By mid-afternoon, Matthews had loaded all the money into his car. He drove to pick up Cheryl, who'd packed a single suitcase containing essential items they'd need immediately: clothes, toiletries, the false identity documents they'd prepared, nothing that would slow them down or attract attention. At approximately 4:30 p.m., Matthews and Cheryl drove to John F. Kennedy International Airport. They parked in long-term parking, carrying only the leather bags containing cash and Cheryl's suitcase. Matthews left his car unlocked with keys in the ignition, knowing that someone would eventually steal it, or that law enforcement would find it abandoned, understanding that the car was no longer his concern. They walked to the terminal, purchased tickets with cash for a flight departing that evening, and checked in using the false identities they'd created. The destination of that flight has never been definitively confirmed. Some law enforcement theories suggest Las Vegas, Others suggest Mexico. Still others suggest South America or Caribbean islands. At approximately 7:45 p.m. on July 2, 1973, Frank Matthews and Cheryl Denise Brown boarded a plane carrying approximately $20 million in cash and disappeared from American law enforcement's view forever. In the 50 years since July 2, 1973, Frank Matthews has never been found. The FBI, DEA, and other law enforcement agencies have investigated thousands of leads. They've conducted searches in dozens of countries. They've interviewed hundreds of associates and family members. They've offered rewards for information about Matthews' whereabouts. Nothing has produced any confirmed sighting or any definitive evidence of what happened after Matthews boarded that flight in 1973. Some theories suggest Matthews is dead, killed by associates who wanted his money, killed by competitors who saw his vulnerability after he disappeared, dying from natural causes at some point in the 50 years since his disappearance. Other theories suggest he's alive, living under a false identity in a country without extradition treaties with the United States, having successfully achieved what very few criminals ever achieve, a complete escape from their criminal past. What's certain is that Matthews successfully disappeared with approximately $20 million in cash, that he's never been arrested or conclusively located, and that his disappearance remains one of the most frustrating unsolved cases in law enforcement history. But what law enforcement never understood, what they couldn't understand because they didn't know about Matthews' relationship with Bumpy Johnson, was the philosophical foundation that made Matthews' disappearance possible. They saw a criminal fleeing prosecution. What they didn't see was a student applying lessons learned from a mentor 8 years earlier. Bumpy Johnson had told Frank Matthews in May 1968, "Everything has a beginning and an end. The art is knowing when to end and having the discipline to actually end it when that moment comes. I never learned that art, but you're smarter than I was." Matthews proved Johnson right. He was smarter. He did learn the art. And when the moment came in July 1973, when continuing meant losing everything to law enforcement, Matthews had the discipline to actually end it, to walk away with his freedom and his wealth before law enforcement could take both from him. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Matthews lasted only 3 years, from March 1965 until Johnson's death in July 1968. But those 3 years gave Matthews advantages that most criminals never receive. Mentorship from someone who'd succeeded at the highest levels for decades, strategic wisdom that came from a lifetime of experience, and, most importantly, the philosophical insight that knowing when to end is more valuable than knowing how to begin. Bumpy Johnson never learned the art he described to Matthews. Johnson kept operating even when he should have stopped. Went to prison in 1953 because he didn't know when enough was enough, came back in 1963 and rebuilt rather than retiring, died at 63 instead of living longer because criminal life consumed him completely. But Johnson's inability to apply this wisdom to his own life didn't diminish the wisdom itself. And Frank Matthews, younger, more disciplined, paying attention to lessons from someone smarter, proved that the art of knowing when to end could actually be mastered and successfully applied. Matthews' disappearance in July 1973 demonstrated several profound truths that Bumpy Johnson had tried to convey. Intelligence matters more than power. Matthews succeeded not because he was the most violent or the most ruthless, but because he was the most strategic, the most disciplined, the most willing to think ahead and plan for contingencies, including the ultimate contingency of needing to disappear. Knowing when to end is harder than knowing how to begin. Thousands of criminals start, operations every year. Almost none of them know when to stop, recognize when continuing becomes more dangerous than ending. Matthews recognized that moment and acted on it. Discipline is the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Many criminals know intellectually that they should quit while they're ahead. Almost none have the discipline to actually do it. Matthews had that discipline. Success means different things at different times. Early in Matthews' career, success meant building wealth and power. By 1973, success meant preserving freedom and keeping the wealth already accumulated. Matthews understood that definition of success changes based on circumstances. 50 years later, law enforcement still searches for Frank Matthews. The $20 million he took still represents one of the largest amounts ever stolen by a criminal who successfully disappeared. The mystery of his whereabouts still frustrates agents who've spent careers trying to solve it. But for people who understand the relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Matthews, there's no mystery about why Matthews disappeared when he did. He disappeared because he learned the art that Bumpy Johnson described but never mastered, the art of knowing when to end and having the discipline to actually end it when that moment comes. That's the power of mentorship from someone wise enough to recognize their own failures and generous enough to help someone else avoid repeating them. That's the legacy of Bumpy Johnson's final lesson. Not his successes, but his recognition that knowing when to end was an art he never learned, and his hope that someone smarter could learn it and apply it successfully. And that's the wisdom Frank Matthews demonstrated on July 2nd, 1973, when he walked away from everything he'd built because he understood that preserving freedom and wealth was more important than continuing to build wealth while risking everything. Somewhere in the world, if he's still alive, Frank Matthews lives, as proof that Bumpy Johnson was right. Everything has a beginning and an end, and knowing when to end is an art that, once mastered, can mean the difference between dying in prison and living free.